Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk today. I'm just going to wait maybe another minute or so for anyone that is joining, but thank you for being here. My name is Prince. The talk I want to do today is about the importance of young memoirs. So, a lot of this will be about ageism, about memoir as a genre, and how young people have and do use it as a way to talk about their lives and their narratives. And then at the end, I'm going to leave a few minutes for some questions. So if you have any questions you want to plug into the Q&A, you totally can. Yeah, and I'll just wait maybe another minute or two for people to join in. I hope everyone's doing good today. And in the chat, I'm just going to share a link to um, a blog post that's mentioned later on, but it's by the author Chloe Gong. Since a lot of this talk is about ageism, so I'm just going to plug that into the chat so people have that. And I'll just wait maybe another minute or two for people to join in. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And this is a total side note, but I live in New York and I went out last night. I went to a listening party. I saw the singer JoJo. I don't know if anyone knows the singer JoJo. She sang Leave, Get Out. She was an aquamarine. I saw her, and for the first time in my life, I was starstruck. So just sharing that as a little icebreaker. But I went up to her. I told her I loved her music. Oh, she was so beautiful. She was so beautiful. Best made my week. Made my week. Yeah, so I'll maybe just wait like maybe 20 more seconds and then I'll get started. But thank you everyone for being here. My name is Prince. I'm gonna kind of introduce myself a little bit when I get into the slides. But yeah, this is a talk on the importance of young memoir. I published my first book last year. This is the paperback, which is actually coming out in 10 days. So check that out. I'll post a link in the chat so people can check out my book if you want, but I'm going to get started. Okay, so the importance of young memoir. So I really wanted to do this topic because I'm 29 years old now. I published my first book last year when I was 28. I started writing it or thinking about it when I was like 23, 24. And so for me, there's just a lot that I think about in terms of memoir and how people think about it and how ageism shows up in sort of the literary landscape. And it's something that I'm really, really interested in talking about. So, just some basics about me. I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, to a Jamaican family. I started learning to write when I was around 12, and I started getting into fan fiction and short stories, and I was writing a lot of stuff for the internet. Like I wrote Twilight fan fiction. I wrote Pretty Little Liars fan fiction. I wrote zombie fiction. And so I got really deep into internet writing culture. And that's something I'm going to talk about a little later on in this presentation, how internet writing culture kind of cultivates young writers. And then when I was in college, I started organizing around Black Lives Matter. And I think understanding and reading more about Black history gave me a sort of political lens to kind of look at my writing, and my writing kind of shifted. And then after college, I traveled a lot and I was reading about Baldwin. And so I think having a global perspective on my Blackness also shifted my writing as well. And now I live in New York City. You can see two books there. My memoir came out last year, and then I also have an essay in a really great anthology called It Came from the Closet. And that's an anthology of queer or queer essays by queer and trans writers about horror. And it's really, really good. So if you want to check out either of those, you're definitely more than welcome. Um, and yeah, so to kind of start this discussion, in October 2022, I published my first book at the age of 29, a book that started in thinking. I started thinking about and writing at the age of 22. A common question that I get during the drafting, publishing, and post-publication processes, but you're so young. How can you write a memoir? How can you write a memoir in your 20s? You haven't lived life yet. And this response is really interesting to me because I think it tells us that young people's lives and stories are valued differently than older people, or they're valued differently than people who are above a certain age. And what I always respond with is that there are plenty of young people throughout history that have changed the trajectory of human society. There are young people that have exposed injustices. There are young Black people that have been killed before their time by police or other brutal systems like racism or white supremacy or policing. And so when people say these things about young people and their inability to kind of have the wisdom to tell these kind of stories, I always respond with, young people are a part of history. And I kind of situate this question in around the time of 2016 and 17. I was living, so I graduated college in 2015, and in 2016 I was living in Seattle. I was working as a boycott organizer, and I wasn't really happy with Seattle, and I knew I wanted something else. And I started learning about James Baldwin, and then I decided to go to France for the first time. I went to France. I met my first boyfriend. I went to a riot. I fell in love. I came back to the US. I did organizing around Get Out to Vote during the 2016 presidential election. I went to Standing Rock. For those that don't know, Standing Rock was a movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. And then I went to the Philippines and I traveled there for 3 months. I went to South Korea. I traveled. And while I was away, I experienced all sorts of anti-Blackness and all these intense experiences. And I kind of mentioned this period of time because even though I was young, I was very much aware that I was living life like very deeply. And also I was very aware of my mortality. I was very aware of these social systems that were constantly pushing and pulling at me. And in all of the reading that I was doing and the writing that I was kind of thinking about, I was thinking about how can I make a body of work that rivals my lifetime? And I think for any young person that's experienced any kind of dysfunction or trauma, there is this notion of having a foreshortened future, of thinking you don't have much time left. And so just that emotional place is such a real place for me. It's where this memoir came to me. And I think it's a place that many young people experience today, especially in the world that we live in. And this kind of brings me to the point of how when we feel a lack of agency in our lives, it often compels us to make art, to think about the kind of stories that we want to tell. And so that's just like a very, I don't know, I just wanted to start there because it feels very important to kind of situate us in what are some of the emotional realities about why people want to write about their lives. And I think for young people, having so much autonomy taken away from you, just politically, socially, it compels people to like want to make art, which I think is a really important thing. And so next I want to talk about the impact of young memoirs. So kind of looking at a few examples of different memoirs that have kind of impacted me, or I feel like they represent something about trying to shift or change or move some kind of conversation. And so the first one that we'll talk about is Panther Baby by Jamal Joseph. This is one of my favorite memoirs. I was reading it when I was kind of researching my book and figuring out how I wanted to write. But Panther Baby was published in 2012. This memoir is the one of the only published accounts of the Black Panther Party from a young member's perspective. It charts Jamal Joseph's journey from kid in Harlem to teenage revolutionary in Rikers Island to being a part of the Black Liberation Army, and then going on to be a professor and filmmaker. And I mention this because this is it's not necessarily a memoir written by a young person, but it's a memoir written within a span of time that is a young adult, and it doesn't interject like an older perspective necessarily. Like it's written in that span of time from the narrator's perspective, very much so. And I think it's just a really great example of how we can look at history from a young person's perspective. And it really blew me away when I read it. So I'd recommend for anyone out there that hasn't, check it out because it's a really, really good book. And let's see. I had a video that I maybe wanted to show, but maybe not for today. That's just a video about the book. And then, of course, another really, really pivotal, well-known, and necessary example is the Diary of Anne Frank. And so, since it was first published in 1947, Anne Frank's diary became one of the most powerful memoirs of the Holocaust. Its message of courage and hope in the face of adversity has reached millions. The diary has been translated into 70 languages, over 30 million copies sold. And I mentioned this because this was a book that I had taught to me in school. And I remember reading it voraciously. I remember being so emotionally invested, and it led me to like buy my own journal. And I'm sure it's done that for so many other young people, but it's an example of a young person writing about their life, and that writing somehow reaching the masses and having significant impact, because it is like a very curious thing to think about how many young people's perspectives are there of the Holocaust in this particular sense or way, or what is the power of this representation. And I remember reading this when I was maybe 12 or 13, and it just, I don't know, it just blew me away, and it led me to have my first little journal. I remember it was like I think a wooden journal that had like a plastic clasp over it. And so I loved this book, and it's just, yeah, it means a lot to me. And so next we're going to go into what is young memoir. And just also for people that are watching, in about 10 minutes near the end of this, I'm going to answer a few questions. So if you have any questions, plug it into the Q&A if you feel so inclined. Hold on, I'm trying to see where this chat went. Okay. Okay, so next slide. What is young memoir? So I'm going to talk about some of the qualities that I think young memoir is. And here are a few points that I have. So young memoir, it explores a significant portion of a young person's life, usually from the narrator's perspective, from like at that younger age. So it delves into a substantial period of their young adult life. This can be your teenage years, this can be college, this can be a number of things. But while older perspectives might be present sometimes, I feel like the larger part of the narrative should be from that young person's perspective. And then another kind of quality of young memoir is it reckons with theme common for people who are coming of age. And although these themes can kind of happen in any story, it's just kind of the coming of age genre is kind of about the threshold from young adulthood to adulthood, or from immaturity to maturity. And so young memoir typically deals with things like body image or trauma or sexuality or place in the world. I knew when writing my book, I wanted to write about how masculinity was kind of this social force in my life from childhood to being in college and now being after college, and also about these social and political forces like immigration, like Blackness, like colorism, like homophobia. And so looking at these themes and how they particularly affect young people, I think also like young adulthood is kind of the intersection of all these different points of our lives. It's where desires are being realized. It's where we're kind of acknowledging that themes are kind of a force that are enacting upon our lives in a kind of real way. And then, oh yeah, okay, in the chat, someone said Persepolis is also a great example. Yeah, I thought of mentioning that in this talk as well. And then another thing that young memoir can do is it deals with or acknowledges ageism towards young people. And so in a lot of ways, when I was writing my book, I wanted to look at how family and dysfunction often removes the agency of young people, how it disempowers you from being able to share your opinions in a family that is dysfunctional. You can react by people pleasing. And so I think ageism and like a lack of care for a young person's psyche or mind, this can show up intrapersonally, like in a family, or it can be structural. It can be something that happens at school or at your job, or it can be happening on a political level, how young people don't have as many political rights as people that are 18 and above. And so even just thinking of narrative and conflict in terms of how ageism in the most simple of ways shows up. And in memoir, I think you have a lot of opportunity to write about these things, because especially if you're from a marginalized background. I mean, I remember in high school, you go downtown to the mall, they didn't even let you use the bathroom in the mall because they kick out every Black teenager. And so we can look at how racism and Blackness and just all of these identities also contribute and are a part of how ageism can show up. And I think it can be something really powerful that I want to see showing up more on the page. Like when I think of reading Diary of Anne Frank, I think about her longing to kind of be understood and seen by her family while she was in hiding. And then, and I also mentioned the last one because I also think being young and sort of entering political realizations is like a really interesting trope in the kind of coming of age or a young narrative kind of genre. So there's a kind of earnestness to navigating like changing political ideology or ways that we view the world or how social or political systems show up in our world, and looking at social unrest. I think there is a lot of plausibility to trusting and caring for how young people look at political events and situations. And so I knew when writing my book, I knew I wanted to talk about Black Lives Matter. I wanted to talk about Standing Rock. I wanted to talk about what it's like to go to other countries and to engage in what's happening there politically and how that can affect you and how it can change you and how that is an important thing for all young people to experience. And I think there is something to like the young travel narrative in a sense. I'm thinking of like On the Road is like another kind of example. Even though that's fiction, it's kind of based on the author's life in a lot of ways. And just a reminder, if anyone's out there and you have any questions, you can definitely plug them in the Q&A section. But moving onward, so when thinking about this in terms of like the different qualities of a memoir that I mentioned, a central question that we can ask ourselves as lovers of literature is, if the coming of age genre is so revered in fiction, why is the same reverence not given to young people aiming to write about their own lives and experiences? And so one perspective that supports the notion of giving young people the same reverence for writing about their life experiences rooted in the philosophy of empowerment and equal representation. In the realm of fiction, the coming of age genre is celebrated because it allows the reader to connect with this sort of universal idea of the human experience of growth, or self-discovery, of overcoming challenges. And these are all things that young people do, yet on a nonfiction narrative level, the young person's life isn't as respected, or the young writer's interpretation of their life isn't as respected. And then to that point, there's also, you can also say that there is a wisdom or authenticity to youth. So existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre celebrated authenticity, emphasizing the importance of embracing one individual experiences and the idea that individuals possess the power to change their own destinies. And then I also think there's an importance to young people writing about their lives because it bridges these generational gaps. I think naturally for anyone as they get older, it can be more difficult to relate to young people, yet young people's experiences are, there's a rawness there because of the lack of agency that is offered to young people politically. And so paying attention to that, paying attention to the notion that young people are the future, why would their narratives not matter as much then? And so we're going to look at some examples of contemporary young writers. So I really wanted to talk about Chloe Gong because I knew, like, just thinking of like young writers and ageism and different things. I remember reading the blog post that I'm going to talk about in a little bit that Gong wrote a few years ago. But Gong began writing books at the age of 13 using Notes app on her iPad. By December 2020, she had written 9 books and about 1 manuscript per year. In 2021, she graduated with a double major in English and international relations from University of Pennsylvania. She wrote her 2020 debut, These Violent Delights, in May 2018 after her freshman year of college. And the book is features a 1920s Romeo and Juliet-esque storyline in Shanghai. And so this is like a world-renowned author who was published in college, and they haven't necessarily written memoir, but I kind of want to use Chloe as an example of looking at how ageism can show up in the literary landscape and how young people kind of deal with sort of success or being in the spotlight. And so Chloe wrote a piece for her website called The Truth About Being a Youth in Publishing, and I'll just read a little bit of it. This is the age of the internet. I can guarantee most young writers making their way through the publishing industry now got their start on AO3, fan fiction, Wattpad. We've been writing for a while. We've been building our skill sets, learning what works and what doesn't, using beta reading feedback from strangers and sticking to an uploading schedule. And so Chloe's just really talking about how plenty of people cut their teeth writing online who are young. And to me, there's this whole kind of generation of people that are young and writing about their stories. And I think on a fiction level, it's kind of seen as whimsical or a good hobby. But I wonder what would happen if young people were encouraged to write about their lives on a nonfiction level and to do it voraciously and to do it as much as websites like fan fiction and Wattpad. And I was all over Wattpad. Like, I remember I published like entire novels on there in high school. Like in high school, I probably wrote like 4 books, maybe 5 books. So like there are these spaces that are kind of incubating young writers, and I wonder what would happen if nonfiction was encouraged in a more serious way. And then another great memoir that I love that I definitely wanted to mention is Boy Erased by Gerard Conley. This book was also adapted into a movie, but it's basically about Gerard Conley, who came out at the age of 19 and actually was outed. And because he was outed, his family, who was religious, sent him to a conversion therapy program. And Boy Erased is about his experiences going through that program, healing afterwards, and kind of reckoning with this religious violence, this familial violence, and their kind of queerness. And I want to mention Gerard because this is definitely a book about young adulthood, but it's through a very particular set of themes. And it took Conley time to write it. I mean, so they were in this program for 6 months, and then they escaped it. And then over the next 10 years, they did college and joined the Peace Corps and did HIV and AIDS education. And by the time that 10 years passed, he felt like he was ready to write this book. And so he started, I think he published it when he was 29. And so I think this is just an example of how a powerful nonfiction representation of a young person's experience can be used towards a social cause, which is banning conversion therapy and giving queer and LGBTQIA people autonomy, even in situations where their family might be religious or trying to force them to do things. So definitely wanted to mention this book. And then kind of just thinking a bit more, so digging a little deeper, we can kind of say a deeper philosophy on the need for young stories is, in a world increasingly ravaged by economic turmoil, political unrest, growing temperatures because of climate change, the threat of the threat of gun violence. There's this looming question: what are the young to make of a world and social systems built to consume and destroy, and what hope for a future should young people have in such a world? And in a society where the morality of young people is not fully respected, where do young people turn to express ourselves? Or how do we find our way into history? And this comes back to me kind of mentioning earlier, like when I was experiencing all these things in 2016 and 17, I thought, like I had this sense that I was going to die younger because of a variety of reasons. And writing my life story became even more important. So in this world where there are all these systems harming the planet, harming young people, harming society, shouldn't young people get to tell their stories as well? And then, so that's kind of a repetition, but so to kind of end, when young people are encouraged to write their stories, this both combats ageism and presents a whole new world of how young people's experiences and political opinions can shift the larger kind of social and cultural psyche. And yeah, so that's pretty much everything I have for this talk. I'm gonna check out the Q&A section to see if anyone has any questions. And so let's see. And so this question is, what are my thoughts on considerations for young people or people of any age, memoirs who may be covering sensitive and personal topics, trauma, family dysfunction that are relatively recent or involve people whom the writer is still in relationship with? I think to this question, it's important to do your research. It's important to be very clear about the fact that you're presenting a subjective perspective. I also think an important part of memoir is drawing boundaries around the kinds of trauma that you're going to write about. I know for my book, I mainly wanted to focus on things that had deeply affected me on a personal level in terms of how I experienced my family, how I experienced masculinity, how I learned things about my father or my cultural background. And there were other things in my family, in my life that I didn't write about because I felt like those weren't my stories to tell. And I think it's important to also look at stigma and how stigma kind of forces us to question or silence or rethink how we want to talk or write about certain things. But I just think it's like really important to think about your boundaries. And especially when people are alive, it's important to understand what those boundaries are. And so maybe just come up with a list of questions for yourself about how you want to write, what you're writing, what you do or don't want to include, and kind of stick to that in all parts of the process. And then another question um, is is it important or advisable for millennials and Zoomers to acknowledge history and social dynamics from time periods before we ourselves were alive within our written pieces when reflecting upon our own personal experiences? I would say, yeah. I think that, yeah. I mean, I think to me, memoir is essentially a genre about memory. And so that can be personal memory, it can be cultural memory, it can be socio-political memory, it can be national memory. And so I think the past comes through in many different forms. But I think when looking at current events, it's always helpful to kind of trace a line or look at patterns or to figure out what the trajectory of the past is in terms of how we're experiencing the present. And that I just know that and experience and understand that as even an essay writer, because the more interesting kind of stories always involve the past in some way, or I think a lot of times they do. Any other questions out there? Let me look at the chat area. Um, yeah, if anyone has any questions about memoir writing or anything. So why do people write memoirs? I think people write memoirs for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes people write it because they have something important that they want to express that they don't think they can write in any other form. Sometimes you go through an intense chapter or period of your life and you want to process and reckon with what that period of time meant. Sometimes you want to archive or document your family or your history or a political experience or moment, because literature is also essentially like a historical record as well. And so to me, memoirs are essentially humans contributing to this larger kind of historical record, which has been done all throughout history. I mean, colonizers wrote and documented their travels. So, I mean, people should be able to write memoirs, I think, as well. Um, any other questions out there? If not, I think, I mean, we just have another minute or two. I'll hang out with you all. I'm glad we're here. And if anyone is interested, my book is titled When They Tell You to Be Good. It comes out in actually 10 days in paperback. It came out in hardcover last year, but I describe it as my political coming of age. So, what it was like growing up queer in a Jamaican family, then being radicalized by Black Lives Matter, and then traveling abroad, navigating anti Blackness. And also, a lot of it is me sort of navigating questions about my father's murder and masculinity and queerness. And it's non-linear. It's kind of a travelogue. It's a lot of different things. Yeah, I thank everyone for being here. I really appreciated having the time to kind of talk through this idea, which has been a big kind of thought bubble in my mind. And thank you so much. Yeah, check out my memoir. It comes out in paperback. There's a virtual event for it. Come to my virtual event. I'll see you there. But yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I'm gonna go to Chinatown and eat some food, but have a great rest of your medium day. Um, I'm just gonna hang out until the very end. Um, Thank you everyone. I really appreciate everyone being here. It's great to talk about these things. Oh yeah, someone left a comment about genealogical research. I actually taught a workshop about family archival and genealogical research last month in DC. You can check out my website for the info about my book event. Let me see if I can share a link really quick with all of you. to let you. Ooh, time crunch. Yeah. You can check out like my link tree. My virtual book event is there. Thank you everyone for being here. Best place to find me is I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, I'm on TikTok. You can find me on YouTube. I have a podcast. You can kind of just Google my name, Prince Shakur, and you can probably find me. But yeah, find me on Twitter. I love talking to other writers on Twitter. Yeah, thank you all for being here. I am going to head out.